Get ready, fighters! Let's party!
Street Fighter Alpha 3, or 03 as it's known in Japan, is the third and final game in the Alpha series. Alpha 3 is a strange entry for a number of reasons. It plays quite differently compared to its predecessors, enough that you could argue that it's almost an entirely new game. Released after Street Fighter 3, it occupies a curious moment in the franchise, with two mainline Street Fighter branches running in parallel. What's weirdest of all though is that it got an update this year. It wasn't a minor update either, that in some ways turns its recent re-release into the definitive version. Now, I'm extremely familiar with the first two games. I'd never really given Alpha 3 much attention until now though, mostly because the emphasis on combos and juggling at launch just didn't do it for me. Given that Alpha 3 was recently released on current gen, I figured that now was as good a time as any to take a proper look at it. So, like my other retrospectives, this video will cover the game's origins, the numerous versions and ports of it, what your options are for playing it today, and lastly, what I think of the game in 2025. Alright, that's the preamble.
It's showtime!
I covered the Alpha series origins in my Alpha 2 video, so I'm not going to cover it in the same detail here. If you want to understand their impact on the fighting game genre and their importance to Street Fighter in general, consider this a plug to go watch that video. The bite-sized version is that Street Fighter Alpha and its sequel were highly influential games. They helped re-establish Street Fighter's dominance in the 2D fighter space in the mid-90s, and they would serve as the foundation for numerous other Capcom fighters. Unlike Alpha 2, which came out less than a year after the original, Alpha 3 would take another 2 years to arrive. This meant that it dropped long after Capcom had shipped Street Fighter 3. Now, there's little to no information on the game's development history, or what motivated Capcom to have two Street Fighter series running concurrently. But based on sales information, one possible explanation could be that Alpha 3 was a reaction to Street Fighter 3's poor commercial performance. While Street Fighter 3 was generally received positively by critics and hardcore fans, it didn't sell. It lacked recognizable characters, it was too technical for the casual audience, it required expensive new arcade hardware, and outside of the Dreamcast, which in itself wasn't a huge success, no home system at the time would have been able to run it without huge cuts. Alpha 2, on the other hand, was a commercial success. So while it's definitely not confirmed, it's possible that rather than bet the farm on Street Fighter 3, Capcom hedged their bets on another Alpha game. Alpha and 03 hit the arcades in June of 1998, and then 6 months later it came home, just in time for Christmas. It has a strong cast of returning characters, it's accessible enough for casual audiences but deep enough for arcade fans, and most importantly, it runs on the original PlayStation. The game was a hit, both in the arcades and on console. It wasn't the huge success that Alpha 2 had been, but successful enough that it would end up being ported to heaps of other platforms in the following years, and all of them were good. Capcom's bet had paid off. Alpha 3 is nearly as confusing as Alpha 2 when it comes to its versions and ports, especially when talking about characters. Unlike Alpha 2 and 02, the original CPS2 arcade versions of Alpha 3 and 03 are basically identical, except for some localization differences. When it came home, the first platform it released for was the original PlayStation. This version added some new characters, DJ, Fei Long, T-Hawk and Guile. It added Boxer, Julie and Junie to the player's select screen too, who were previously hidden. On top of this, there are new modes, including the Dramatic Battle mode and the World Tour, the latter of which is kind of like an expanded story mode with RPG-like elements. In contrast to other Capcom fighting games ported to the system, Alpha/03 is a fairly faithful conversion of the arcade game and it runs smoothly. This was largely due to some clever engineering and optimization. That's not to say it doesn't have problems. It still suffers from long load times, less frames of animation, and occasional dips in the frame rate. By and large though, it's widely regarded as the zenith of 2D fighters on the platform. The Sega Dreamcast got a port in 1999 called Saikyo Dojo. This added some new gameplay style modes that you select before each match. Without going into too much detail, outside of the normal mode, there are essentially different types of handicaps that modify how your character plays. It uses the same character roster as the PS1 version, but now also lets you unlock the boss version of Bison, called Final Bison. In addition, it adds a new score attack mode. Otherwise, it remains very similar to the PlayStation version, although it's technically an upgrade. Fewer frames of animation were cut, performance and load times are improved, and at the time it was considered the definitive way to play Alpha 3 at home. Also in '99, the Saturn got a port of 03 exclusively in Japan. It's largely the same as the PS1 game, albeit without the same level of compromises. It was generally considered the best port of the arcade game at the time, being even more arcade perfect than the Dreamcast version, despite running on less powerful hardware. In 2001, an updated version for the arcade called Street Fighter 03 Upper was released. This was the final arcade release, and it runs on Sega's Naomi arcade hardware. It added the 4 new characters from the console ports, it also made a number of balance changes, and it has VMU support. Now, randomly the Game Boy Advance got a port of Alpha 3 Upper in 2002. This added more characters still, Yun, Maki and Eagle. On paper, the GBA sounds like a pretty shit candidate for a port, and yeah, this version has smaller sprites, lacks some backgrounds and sounds, such as the announcer, and its world tour is stripped back. It also had its frame rate and animation significantly cut down. Don't let that fool you though. Like the SNES port of Alpha 2, it's kind of amazing considering the hardware it's running on, and most importantly, it's very playable. In 2006, Alpha 3 Upper was ported to the PSP. This version of the game is called Alpha 3 Max, or 03 Double Upper as it's known in Japan. And surprise surprise, it added another character, Ingrid from Capcom Fighting Evolution. Despite being designed for a handheld, the visuals are a close match for the arcade. It includes the modes from the earlier console ports as well as a new tag team mode, which is kinda wild. The only downside with this port is that unless you know someone else with a PSP and a copy of the game, it's a single player only experience. The same year, the PS2 got Alpha 3 in the Alpha Anthology and 03 in the Fighters Generation collections. These collections allow you to unlock an arranged version of the game as a hidden extra, which is essentially Alpha 3 Upper, although it doesn't include Yun, Maki, Eagle or Ingrid. What's interesting about these collections is that they have a secret menu that lets you toggle on features from the different arcade and home iterations. If you want a bit more detail on what these features are and how it works, this is another plug to go watch my other video. In 2018, the original arcade release was included in the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. It includes training, versus and online modes, but is otherwise missing the extra features, characters and modes found in the previous home ports. Finally, in 2025, Alpha 3 Upper and 03 Upper were included in the Capcom Fighting Collection 2 for PC, PlayStation, Xbox and the Switch. This was originally presented as an emulation of the arcade version of 03 Upper, and therefore the additional characters from Alpha 3 Max weren't included, until they were. The game received an update a few months after launch that patched in the 4 remaining characters. Also in this patch was the gameplay style modes. As of the making of this video though, it doesn't include the additional modes from the home ports like the World Tour. It only has training, versus, online and dramatic battle via a code. Alright, you still with me? I know, that was a lot. So I want to talk about the game itself now, and specifically the original release and how it differs from Alpha 2. Alpha 3 expands on Alpha 2's roster with 9 new characters: Cody, Karen, Honda, Armika, Vega, Blanca, Julie, Junie, and Boxer. It also includes Cammy, who returns from 02 Alpha. This brings the roster up to 28, and as we just covered, this would eventually balloon up to 39. Many of the returning characters have been given new moves and combos. Sagat, for example, gets the Angry Scar that would appear in future titles, giving his uppercut more damage on the next hit. And Bison gets his iconic Psycho Crusher special. Loads of sprites and animations were updated too. Akuma's kicks, such as his down kick, while functionally the same, looks different to the earlier titles. Another example is Dan's stance. It's been completely overhauled to look less like the other Shotos and to look completely ridiculous. Now, most people will tell you that the biggest change with Alpha 3 is the ISM system. It's an important change for sure, but I don't actually think it's the most dramatic. Here's how it works. Before each fight, you need to select an ISM type. This modifies how your character plays, with each ISM granting you access to unique moves, a unique meter system, and ISM-specific properties. It's similar to the grooves from the Capcom vs SNK games. A-ism or Z-ism if you're playing 03 is the standard, giving you access to all the alpha mechanics such as alpha counters and air blocking. You get a conventional 3-bar super meter and access to multiple supers, but no custom combos. V-ism is similar, except that it gives you the custom combos from Alpha 2. The trade-off is that you no longer have supers. X-ism gives you a single super meter and only one super. For example, Akuma only has his Raging Demon. Additionally, it removes the alpha-specific mechanics found in the other isms. Think of this as the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo-ism. Both A and V isms have slightly different damage properties, but X is the most extreme. It significantly buffs your damage output while also reducing your health, essentially turning you into a glass cannon. I think the downside with the ism system is that, although it adds a ton of depth, it makes the game far less accessible for casuals. It essentially creates 3 versions of each character to learn, and it increases the number of matchups you need to become familiar with. It's unquestionably a departure from Alpha 1 and 2's more straightforward approach, but I think the most fundamental change with Alpha 3 is how it plays. It's much faster, and your ability to juggle opponents is higher. This changes fights from being focused on a back and forth exchange based on the fundamentals into a more combo-focused style where getting hit can lead to big damage. This is another thing that makes the game less accessible. It raises the skill ceiling, and when combined with the isms, it results in a fairly steep learning curve. To be clear, I don't think that being more technical is inherently a bad thing, at least when talking about my own preferences. I do think it makes Alpha 3 the least casual game in the series though. Beyond the isms, there's a new guard gauge. The size of the gauge varies between characters and between ism types. When depleted, you get guard crushed, which opens you up, allowing you to get hit. Every time you get crushed, the maximum size of the gauge reduces too. I really like how this exposes what is often a hidden or overlooked system, and it adds a bit more strategy to it. The Alpha games already had a lot of defensive tools, but air recoveries definitely take some getting used to. They almost act like a combo breaker that prevents you from being juggled. I have never enjoyed how this works, or the flash that happens when you perform one. It kind of feels like Capcom knew that increasing juggling could become obnoxious, and this was kind of a way to mitigate that. Overall though, while I think that Alpha 3 ended up being less casual than maybe Capcom intended, its depth and massive roster make it feel like a genuine sequel rather than just more of the same. There's a lot of nuance in the new mechanics, and although I find its pace more chaotic than Alpha 2, it's unquestionably a good fighting game. Of all the versions I've mentioned, I think there are 2 that stand out for playing it today. If you want to mostly play online against skilled players, then Fightcade is a great way to do that. It's available on PC and Mac and supports lots of different controllers. Otherwise, the versions of Alpha and 03 Upper in the Fighting Collection 2 are pretty hard to beat. You get access to both the Western and Japanese arcade versions, a number of dip switches, online verses, and all 39 characters. Otherwise, if you plan on playing it solo, then just about all the home ports include more modes and things to do offline. The only issue is that acquiring discs, carts, or UMDs can be fucking expensive, so a modded console or emulation is probably your best bet. Spending more time with Alpha 3 hasn't propelled it in front of Alpha 2 as my favourite in the series, but it has given me a newfound respect for it. I actually feel like it's much closer to the modern Street Fighter games than the other Alpha titles in regards to its pacing and focus on combos, and I think this illustrates how forward-thinking many of its mechanics were. As a massive fan of the Alpha series, I like that this wasn't just more of the same. Capcom could have easily played it safe, but instead chose to make some big changes, to the point where this feels very unique, and I respect that. I'd still recommend Alpha 2 as the best entry point into the 2D Street Fighter games, but if you haven't given Alpha 3 a proper go, it's worth checking out, especially if you enjoy deep fighters. It has a huge roster, and even almost 3 decades after its original release, it still holds up as an excellent example of the genre.